And we've got a wonderful speaker. And I'm going to introduce Sophie. I've been on the internet
That's always dangerous.
using Dr. Google to find out what I can about Sophie. And as I was looking at a couple of different websites, I'm thinking, I think Sophie might have written this. So we might check that out later. And also, the thing about websites is that they're not always kept up to date. So some of the information that you get, might be a little bit out of date. So there might be a bit of fact checking to do along the way. So anyway, I'll tell you what I found, and then Sophie can correct it afterwards. Sophie is an experienced company director who has worked in Australia and internationally across private and public businesses, professional services and not-for-profits. She's worked in diverse sectors including law, agriculture, manufacturing, retail and wholesale, hospitality and tourism, early childhood, education and training, and social and welfare support. Doesn't really leave any time for hobbies by the sound of it. This is the bit that might need updating. Currently Chair of Peak Care Equipment Proprietary Limited, National Association of Women in Operations, ROC, R-O-C-C, I don't know what that is, Independent Chair of RSL New South Wales, currently Deputy Chair of the Shoalhaven Women's Resource Group, and a Director and owner of Silos Estate Winery. She spent 14 years as a corporate lawyer at Dunhill, Madden Butler and Price Waterhouse Coopers in Sydney and London, and also sat on the board of the PwC Foundation. She has particular skills in working with companies in highly regulated industries across a range of regulatory environments and with companies with complex geographical spreads, workforces and stakeholders. She's moved around a bit. She's lived and or worked in the UK, China, France, Uganda and in both Sydney and regional New South Wales. Beautiful berry, of course. Consequently, she brings a unique perspective and agility to the companies with which she works. She's a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, a graduate of Women on Boards ASX program and a member of Women on Boards. But she's best known to us as the Chair of the Shoalhaven Education Fund and of course through Silos. The church and the Men's Shed have jointly made contributions to the Education Fund in the last couple of years. So join me in welcoming Sophie.
Thank you, John. Any of you know LinkedIn, which is a social media site for mostly professionals, will recognise that as my LinkedIn profile. John's just read that. And I'm someone who does things like LinkedIn because you sort of have to if you're looking at board roles and so on, but take it with a grain of salt. Everything that's there was factual, but it's written in a particular way to make it sound a particular way, particularly when recruiters are looking for people. So take all that with a grain of salt, but you will hear more about some of that today. So firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here. There's a few faces I know locally. Really grateful to Janet and John for asking me to do this. We have been in Berry now 16 years, so Berry is very much home, although I was told a year or two after we moved here, I was asked by a dairy farmer at church one day how long we'd been here, and when I said 2 years, he said, "Oh, well, you've got 3 generations to go before this is your." So I've produced 1 generation. They're at school at the moment, but we've got a way to go. But really lovely to be here. Janet asked me to talk a bit about me. What I wanted to do today, I will tell you a little bit about my background, but really what I want to do is tell you a little bit about some of those things I do that John read out, and particularly the local organisations I work with, some of which you'll probably be familiar with, some of which you may not have heard so much about. The nature of the work that we do in some of those organisations means that we fly under the radar a bit. So really that's what I'd like to spend most of my time on today. But just to start off a little bit, so going right back to the very beginning, and for Annie who knows my mother from the Arbor, that's Mum up there, you might recognise her. So that's me. The dog who's clambering on top of me is Sophie dog. So I was named after my godmother's Cocker Spaniel. That's Sophie dog. With my mum in Oxford in England in 1973. So I was born in the UK to parents who, like many Australians, had started off in England, migrated out here when they were 9, so 10-pound poms essentially, and then ended up back in the UK. My father was a scientist and they moved back to Oxford in the 1960s for him to do his PhD, and we were there for about 10 years, moved back to Australia when I was 1, and then spent most of my childhood going backwards and forwards largely between Oxford and Sydney. But we also lived in the United States, in China, in France, and various other places because of my father's academic career. The picture on the right is my brother and sister, and me in the middle, when I was about 5. So I love that photo just because, you know, you look at those kids and you think, I wonder what they thought about what was going to happen. So my brother on the right there is now the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner. He worked for the United Nations in New York for 20 years and he's just come back and has been appointed the first Anti-Slavery Commissioner in New South Wales. And my sister on the left has been living in Darwin for about 25 years. She's a doctor, specialises in Indigenous health and public health. So sweet little nest of faces there, and that's where we are now. As I said, we spent a lot of my childhood moving backwards and forwards. We were quite settled. We lived in the same house in Strathfield, always came back to the same house, went to one school for primary school, different school for high school. But I went to school in England, in a tiny village school, you know, with 15 kids across the whole of the primary school. Went to a school in San Francisco. So we moved around a bit. And when I finished school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I'd done a lot of debating. I loved history and French and the arts. So I thought, well, I'll do an arts degree. And people said, oh, well, you've got the marks to do law, so you should do law as well. So I kind of thought, all right, well, I'll do law. I'm never intending to be a lawyer at all. And found myself towards the end of my law degree working as a summer clerk, so as a summer intern at a big Sydney law firm, and I loved it. And most of my time, I was a litigator, so I spent a lot of my time in court, in the Supreme Court and the Federal Court, working mostly with businesses who were being prosecuted because they'd done the wrong thing. So I was working with the businesses, and that was everything from mum and dad businesses, so gift shops and so on, right through to big multinationals. What I really wanted to do when I was a teenager was be an actress. And for various reasons that didn't happen. But what you find is there's an awful lot of barristers and particularly lawyers who go down the paths of being in court a lot who are actually failed actors and actresses, or want to be actors and actresses. So I felt very at home in that regard. Not long after I joined the law firm permanently, there was a big merger with PricewaterhouseCoopers, the accounting firm, and we became part of this enormous global organisation, which had pros and cons, but essentially I had a great time there. I was there for 15 years, and there were some opportunities, and this is one of them. In 2004, I was selected to be the Australian representative on a global leadership course that they ran, and part of that was a year-long program, and part of that was going to Uganda for 4 months to work with the United Nations. And so I spent 4 months in Uganda. We were working with the United Nations on a program trying to support all the organisations that were working on HIV/AIDS. So I don't know if you know much about Uganda, but the Ugandan president was one of the very first African leaders to acknowledge the existence of HIV/AIDS. His son died of it. Fairly early days, we're talking early 90s, I think, and he came out and said, yes, this is what my son died of and we need to do something about this. And that was fairly unique because for a long, long time, many countries in Africa denied the existence, buried their heads in the sand, said it doesn't exist, it's not a problem. So Uganda, because of that, what then happened was that all of the non-government organisations, the not-for-profits, the church-based organisations from all around the world said, all right, we can get to Uganda and do something. So there's a huge amount of aid had been thrown at Uganda to work on HIV/AIDS related issues. But it also meant that there was no coordination of any of that. And so what you had was literally hundreds and hundreds of small and large not-for-profit organisations in Uganda, all doing things to do with HIV/AIDS. Some of it was medical health related, some of it was supporting orphans, some of it was structural things, but none of them are coordinated. And so you go to towns, you know, in the middle of nowhere and have 6 organisations all doing the same thing. And one of the things that was happening a lot was there was quite a lot of support for orphans and quite a lot of support for widows, but no support at all for widowers. So men who were left behind when their wives died and were bringing up not only their own children but often their nieces and nephews and so on. trying to, bring them up in very basic, this is, it's very basic circumstances, and there was very little support for the men. So the United Nations had funded the main health body in Uganda to try and, if you like, consolidate these organisations, to try and understand what each organisation was doing, how they were doing it, what money was flowing to it, and work out where the gaps were, work out where there were people in the same town doing the same thing, and instead of using two bunches of money for the same thing, they could be better organised to put their efforts in different places. And so our job really was to help with that and to go out into fairly far-flung parts of the country and try and help them to work out what was going on and how on earth were they going to find a way of organising this, bearing in mind that this was pre-internet, pretty much pre-internet in Western countries, let alone in Uganda, so you're not talking about building a database or, having some sort of online organisation. This was manual stuff. So it was an amazing experience. The Ugandan people are just fantastic, welcoming, wonderful, warm people. The kids, so this was an orphanage, there were orphans, there were just millions, literally millions of orphans because of the AIDS epidemic, and this is the sort of conditions they were living in. But at that stage, again, it was pretty much pre-mobile phones, so having the photo taken was a big deal, and they loved to be able to, there were some digital cameras, so they loved to have the photo taken and then be able to look and see what was happening. So that was an amazing experience, and I've been very fortunate to have been able to stay in touch with some of the people I worked with, and some of the Ugandans that I worked with over there. I'm still in touch 20 years later and supporting them and their children in various ways. I think it was probably the first time that I did something, I travelled a lot, but I'd not been involved as a volunteer in actually trying to do things to directly impact people's lives, and that made a big change. The other thing that had happened was 3 months before I went to Uganda, I'd met Raj, my husband, now husband. So this was just sort of the beginning of the next stage of our lives. So I met Raj just before I went in 2004. By the time I came back, we sort of knew we were fairly serious, even though we'd been apart for a while. When I met Raj, he'd had a big career for American Express, and he'd spent 90% of his year travelling overseas. He lived a lot in hotels, and he'd just finished that part of his career. We had both decided individually, and mine was really coming back from Uganda, that I didn't want to be necessarily in the corporate world anymore, that I'd had enough of that. I wanted to find a way of doing other things, and we didn't actually want to be in Sydney either. We wanted to get out of Sydney. So we literally drew a circle on the map around Sydney and said, well, where's about 2 to 3 hours from Sydney, because we knew that if we wanted to move, we'd have to finance that, and we'd likely have to hold jobs in Sydney for a while. Berry was somewhere that we'd come a bit as kids, and my parents, who were living in Oxford at that stage, were planning to retire here. And so we looked around. And just before I went to Uganda, so we met in January, I went to Uganda in April. And as you do in the first flush of romance, I thought, oh, we need to have a romantic weekend away before I go away, and make sure this bloke's all right and he's going to stay around. So we came down to Berry. We stayed at what is now Jasper's, but at that stage was, I don't know what it's called, bed and breakfast, something like that. Yeah. And stayed there, and we had dinner at Silo's. And we can both remember sitting at the restaurant at Silo's saying, oh, this is the sort of thing that we'd like to do one day. And so when we started looking around a couple of years later, it turned out that Silo's was up for sale, and we sort of thought, well, maybe this is meant to be. So that was 16 years ago. So we moved down here 16 years ago. For the first few years, I was still working in the law firm in Sydney. We were travelling up and down every week. Raj was still working in Sydney. Then we had our daughters, went back to work in between. And by the time our second daughter came along, the business was going well. At that stage, our older daughter was 3. We really needed to be, in one place so she could go to preschool and all those sorts of things. And by that stage also, I really just loved being in Berry and being in the community, and I didn't want to be juggling all those things. So I was fortunate enough to be able to take some time off from work and be a mum. That's not really taking time off from work, is it? But, from a job, if that makes sense. So I was largely a mum. As most of you know, we live on site at Silos, so I was a mum, but always jumping in to help out where things needed to be done, which is still the case today. Raj was running the business. And then when the girls, so our daughters are now 14 and almost 12. So when they hit primary school, I was ready to do something else. And then there was a very clear decision. Was it that I was going to go back to a law firm and continue being a lawyer, or was I doing something else? By that stage, I'd been invited to sit on a couple of local committees and boards, the Shoalhaven Education Fund, which I'll talk about in a minute, being one of them. And I really enjoyed that work. It was what I wanted to be doing, working directly to help our community and to work with people in our community. And so Raj, by that stage, was sitting on some corporate boards in Sydney. He said, well, why don't you actually think about joining some boards as a profession? And he will never let me forget till my dying day. He always brings it up. He says that I said to him, that's your thing, that's not my thing, you know, as if I'd want to do that. But it happened, a board came up at Wollongong, an organisation called Big Fat Smile, which runs early childhood. So we ran 42 early childhood preschools and long day cares through southwestern Sydney, the Illawarra, Southern Highlands. I joined that board, and that was the first board I joined, and I was on that board for 6 years. Fabulous board. I was very fortunate to have a chair who let me learn and who let me make mistakes and who would give me feedback. I finished on that board last year. That was the end of my 2 terms. And since then, I've been appointed to a number of other boards, and so that's now essentially what I do full time. Is I sit on boards of organisations, small and large, and I help to run those organisations with a group of other board members. The boards that I chair, I'm working very closely with the general manager or the CEO to support them and support the staff. And so that is where we're up to. Oh, that's sorry. That's on the left is Raj and I on our first day at Silos in 2007. And the middle one was I think at the 10-year anniversary mark probably, and the one on the right is was last year. It was at the 15-year mark. So you can see the broods expanded a bit, and the wrinkles and the grey hairs have kind of crept on, and the trees have got bigger, but we're still there. So just to tell you about a couple of things I do, I won't talk about these two terribly much because they're not local, but these are two of the boards that I currently chair. The one down the bottom, Peak Care Equipment, is based up in Unanderra, so just up near Wollongong. It's a for-profit organisation. We make aged care and health equipment, so everything from wheelchairs, walking sticks, hospital beds, everything you can think of that you'd use around the home if you're older or you've got a disability. We make them. We also negotiate for our member organisations who are shops that you would go into to buy those things. We negotiate prices, and they're members of our organisation. So if any of you knows the Country Care group down in now that sell wheelchairs and things, they're one of our members, and so we work with them to negotiate better prices and bring this new product to them. So that's a for-profit organisation. I chair that. I actually get paid to do that, which is great, because that allows me to do all these other things that I'm going to talk to you about. Really lovely. And NAWO is a national organisation which I actually will be finishing up next Friday as chair of that organisation. So NAWO is a terrific organisation. The aim of NAWO is to try and get more women into senior leadership roles in operational businesses. Now, by operational businesses, I mean mining, logistics, freight, newspapers, anything where it's a business that's producing things, cheese, being a cheese factory. So our members are organisations right across Australia who are puzzling with why they haven't been successful in getting women CEOs, women CFOs, getting women operational managers, and are trying to work out what to do about it. And we work with them to help them look at what they're doing in terms of their hiring and firing policies, what are their parental leave policies, what is it like if you're a woman out on a mine for 6 weeks, what's it actually like? Is it, is there a huge amount of sexual harassment? What is stopping you from being able to do those things? Our members are extremely large, so almost every listed Australian operational company, so Rio Tinto, Woodside, BHP, Linfox, Amazon, they're all our members, and we work with all of them. They pay to be part of our organisation. We work with all of them to try and help them with programs, with design, and actually working also with the women coming through their pipelines. It's a fantastic organisation. It runs on the sniff of an oily rag. It's not for profit. We get no government funding, so we're entirely reliant on our members for funding. We have 5 very hard-working staff based in Melbourne. and it's been an absolute privilege chairing that organisation and seeing some of the change that has occurred while I've been there. As I say, I'll be finishing it up next week, just because my time's at an end, but that's been terrific. RSL New South Wales. Is anyone here a veteran or involved with RSL New South Wales at all? No. So RSL New South Wales is a very distinct organisation, and the first thing I need to say is we are not clubs. So we do not have pokies, we do not serve beers. RSL New South Wales is the sub-branch, runs the sub-branches for all the veterans. We have 350 sub-branches across New South Wales, about 30,000 veterans. RSL clubs are completely separate in New South Wales. Different states are different. In New South Wales, RSL clubs have been separate since the 1970s, when the New South Wales government said that veterans organisations couldn't hold pokie licences or liquor licences, so we're completely separate. The bane of our life is that most people don't know that, and it's very hard to work out how to get that across because we're both called RSL. But RSL New South Wales, some of you may remember a few years ago, went through a pretty torrid time. There was a judicial inquiry into RSL New South Wales because the leadership at the time had been using charitable funds, so funds donated by the public, not for anything that they saw as wrong because they were all veterans, but they were using them for trips overseas and for buying blazers and having very expensive dinners and all these sorts of things. And so there was a judicial inquiry, and Justice Paddy Bergen, who oversaw the inquiry, which went for a number of months, made a whole range of findings, and one of the main findings was, she said, you have to change your board, you have to change the leadership of your organisation, and you need to bring in some independent board members who are not veterans, who are not associated with the veteran community, but who have the experience of running a complex organisation. So I'm going to say you have to have two. RSL New South Wales is governed by a New South Wales Parliament. So the Act of Parliament was changed by the Minister to say that the board had to have two independent board members. And they then went to a recruiter and went through an external recruitment process, and I was one of the first two independents appointed to the board. This is our board. There's one person missing actually. This is our current board. There's another fellow missing. You can see a couple of things. It's not many women. It's two of us at the moment. A lot of blue blazers. There is actually now a range of ages there, which is pretty good. And there are a few of us there who are not from the city. So there's 3 of us really who are not from the city. That is actually, it might not look much of a diverse board, but it's actually a lot better than it was a couple of years ago. It's been a really interesting period. So when I was appointed to the board, the organisation was really, after that judicial inquiry, looking very introspectively and saying, how are we going to change what we do? We have a fundamental problem because the average age of our members is 76. So you can imagine, and we did some projections and we did some mapping and realised that if we did not change that very quickly, within 15 years the organisation would no longer exist, because the rate, very sadly, the rate of drop-off of our older members is increasing, Vietnam veterans particularly. So there was a big move to change the constitution to allow a few things to happen, and that was extremely difficult because 100 years of RSL history, this is the way we do it, with a lot of people who've been in a hierarchy all their lives, persuading them that modernising things and changing was not an easy task. But we managed to do that by the end of my first year on the board. And one of the things that came about as a result of that was that instead of having, we're a bit like a footy club in Victoria, we have an elected president. So the guy in the middle with the white hair, that's Ray James, who's our current elected president, Vietnam veteran from the Navy. We have an elected president, and in the past, the president had always been the chair of the board, which was a problem for a couple of reasons. One was, because the president's elected, you have absolutely no control over who's elected, the members choose. And so they may elect someone who has absolutely no experience of running a business, of understanding finances, of being able to chair, understanding modern governance and so on. No, not their fault, but it's just who they are. And the second thing is the president is so busy. Ray and his wife Pauline are on the road 7 days a week, travelling all over the state, doing commemorations, presentations, all sorts of things. So trying to have someone doing that and doing all the things that are involved in helping to run an organisation and supporting the CEO was really, really difficult. So one of the changes that came with the Constitution was that they were allowed to have a separate chair. It's the first time they'd ever done that. And so the board elects the chair, and so the board elected me as chair. So it's been a very interesting 3 years because I have come in as a non-service member. I haven't served the country. I'm a woman, which in RSL and defence world is still fairly unusual. I'm the first, I wasn't elected, so it's the first time they've had people on their board who weren't elected by the members, and it's the first time they've had a chair who's not president, and it's been wonderful, but challenging to really change the mindset about whether that's acceptable. And you know, it's been, there's been so many wonderful supporters, but there are still a few people who don't think I should be there and don't think I'm legitimate. And you know, at a certain point you just have to start ignoring that once you're confident that most people are happy with what you're doing. So that's been a real change. One of the things, there's a few things I'm really proud of. One of the things I'm really proud of is we do now have more women. So this is my executive team. So on your right, my left is Louise Sullivan with the long dark hair. So Louise is actually an amazing woman. She's a lawyer herself. She is a service member of the board, so she served in the army. And she's also the state president of Netball New South Wales, and sits on the board of Netball Australia, which anyone who knows the netball will know that in itself is a very challenging role, trying to manage that. The other women there on the very left is our Chief Financial Officer, Nicole. Now, to have a young female Chief Financial Officer of an organisation with billions of dollars in assets is pretty amazing. Our Head of Marketing and our Head of Legal. So I'm really proud of that photo because that is in itself a big change in RSL to have that many women. The other thing I just want to draw your attention to is behind us. This was taken in the Anzac Memorial in Sydney. I don't know if any of you have been up there recently, the one that's in Hyde Park. They did a big renovation a few years ago, and if you're ever up there, it's beautiful to go and have a look. They dug into the ground and created a space underground. It's an exhibition space for the museum, but in the middle of it is a light well, huge ceiling looking up to the sky. And they went to every town in New South Wales that had people who'd served and took a bit of the earth. So and it's in alphabetical order, and they're in little canisters set into the wall there. So each of those, you can see some of the names of towns up there. So there's one for Berry. You can go and have a look, and there's a piece of earth that the Berry RSL sub-branch sent in, and it says Berry. So it's a way of remembering the service of everybody who served from all of those places. There's also, particularly in the ground, there are marked pieces of earth from all the different theatres of war that we've served in. So from places in Vietnam, from the Western Front, from Afghanistan, Iraq. It's quite a moving and beautiful memorial. And so yeah, definitely worth having a look at if you get to go there again. We've done lots of things in the time I've been in RSL. It's been a lot of change, it's been tricky, but one of the things that I'm particularly proud of down here is the Nowra Veterans Wellbeing Centre, and I wanted to draw this to your attention because, again, if you're not involved in the veteran space, it's not terribly well known, it's very new. So this is the Nowra Veterans Wellbeing Centre. It's a purpose-built building at East Nowra, just in behind the East Nowra shops, so behind the bakery there. It's at Jonathan Rogers Village, which is a retirement village in East Nowra. So the Veterans Wellbeing Centre, as many of you would be aware, one of the very big issues at the moment is veteran suicide, particularly young veterans coming back from Afghanistan and some of the slightly older ones from Iraq. And there's been a lot of work done to try and understand what's happening, and now the issue is how do we stop that from happening? How do we better support our veterans? How do we better support our families? How do we better support serving defence personnel? And it's particularly relevant down here because, you know, we have HMAS Albatross and also HMAS Creswell in our community. So before the last federal election, two federal elections ago, the federal government, in their wisdom, decided that the solution to this was to build what they were going to call hubs, wellbeing hubs, and they built 7 around Australia in places where there were lots of veterans. And they'd give $5 million each to each of these communities and build a hub. Nowra was the only one of those sites in New South Wales. So there was Darwin, there was one in Adelaide, there was one up in Cairns. It was a very long and torturous process for anyone who ever watched Yes Minister. It was like dealing with Sir Humphrey Appleby. It started with us out of the blue getting an email saying the federal government, the Department of Veterans Affairs is coming to Nowra to talk to all ex-services organisations about the hub, and everyone rang each other and said, you know what this hub's about? I don't know what they're talking about, no idea. And we literally sat in a meeting, this was about 4.5 years ago, sat in a meeting and they said, well, you've got $5 million. And everybody said, what for? And they said, well, you've got to build a hub. And we said, what's the hub? They said, we don't know, it's up to you to decide what a hub. And this is not just RSL, this is the Vietnam Veterans Association, this is every ex-services organisation, everybody looking at legacy, all sorts of things, saying, well, what on earth are we going to do? So a series of meetings, and it became very clear very quickly that somebody had to take the lead on it, and really the only organisation that was set up to take the lead was RSL. So we took the lead on designing it, and then we're told in a meeting, we had a meeting, about half a dozen of us with the minister's offsider, and he said, well, you have to do it by this date, which is only about 2 years away at that point. And I said, oh, but you said it was a 3-year project, and they said, yes, but a year's already gone. We've only told you a year in. I said, all right. And then they said, oh, and it's $5 million, and we said, all right, that's fine, and we're coming up with a plan. And they said, oh, but no, you can't have the $5 million until you've done a business plan and a project plan and had an architect and done all these things. Big thing. And we said, well, what if we don't do that? And this guy just about fell off his chair. He looked horrified, and he said, you can't not take the money. And we said, well, what if we decide that it's just not possible? So then and he said, well, you have to use it. And we said, all right, well, that's fine. We're going to build this beautiful building. Great. But who's going to fund the staff? What happens then? They said, oh, well, that's up to you. And we said, well, can we use some of the $5 million to pay for staff for a year or two to do some fundraising, work up with it? No. The only thing you can use the $5 million for is the bricks and mortar. So in the end, we managed to negotiate that we could use some of that $5 million to pay for all those architects and project plans and all those things we had to do. We spent about a year and a half having an endless series of consultations, because it's very much a collaborative effort. We lead it, but it's very much about all these ex-service organisations being able to have a space where they can come together and provide services to veterans. But you can imagine some of the politics of that, particularly when you try to design something. People have very different ideas about what it should look like, who should be in there, even simple things like what colour should it be or who should it be named after. But we got there, and so it was officially opened last December, just before Christmas. It's actually been operating since about February last year, and we've just hit the 2,000 people mark. So that's 2,000 veterans who have been provided services there, and it's really exciting. And we do a whole range of things there. So some of it's very basic support with housing, support with finding jobs, support with, some of the veterans who've been in a long time will come out and they've never had to look after their own healthcare, because when you're in service you get all your healthcare provided for you. So actually, how do I go about getting a Medicare card? How do I go about finding a doctor? How do I get a mortgage? I've never had to provide, I've been in since I was 17 and now I've come out and I'm 30 and suddenly I have to work out how to find a house, get a rental, buy a house and so on. So it's all the really basic stuff. But there's also a lot of other things. There's sports programs. We run a lot of sports programs there. We work very closely with the ex-services club at Warragee. So we run a lot of sports programs for veterans. We run lots of things for families, and because we are close to the Nowra base, we're also working very closely with the team at the Nowra base. We have staff on base there several days a week to actually be working with people who are not veterans yet, but are at that point of what they call transitioning. So are saying, right, I know that I'm going to be leaving in 2 years' time, and I need to start thinking about what am I going to do when I leave? What do I want to do with my life? So we're trying to work with them through that phase, because that's a really critical phase in making sure that they are well and supported when they come out, and that they're not just, what has been happening is that people get out and they're just left on their own. And again, if you've been in since you were 16, 17, 18, to some extent don't know how to look after yourself. So really hugely proud of that, and I think it's, when I say proud, it's not me being proud of the whole team, but also proud that it's happened in our community. What's happened now is this is now the model for a whole range of, so we've now opened there's one in Wagga that's opened, and federal government has now, prior to the last election and the Labor government's honouring this, there's now 6 more rolling out around New South Wales, 3 or 4 of which will likely be run by RSL and our partner RSL Lifecare. So we should all be proud that the Nowra one has become the model for veterans care across the state. Not to say that there aren't hiccups, there are. And this is a trial. It's not a trial, it's permanent, but this is the one that we're making the mistakes so that other centres can say we learn from those mistakes. And the other thing that's specific about it is it's very specific to the area. So what we need for our veterans in Nowra will be very different from what veterans up in Tweed on the New South Wales Queensland border need, or veterans in Wagga. So the idea is that they are supposed to cater very much to that particular population. So that's RSL. I'm on the RSL board for another couple of years. Watch this space, there'll be lots of interesting things happening, but it's a really great organisation. And we have so many amazing veterans down here, and you would know some of them, and running the sub-branches. There's a huge effort in place to try and get that age down, so we've put in place a strategic plan, which we're now executing. We have managed in the last 2 years to get the average age down from 76 to 72, which doesn't sound like much, but it's a start. And we've got board elections coming up. We've set up a Young Veterans Committee. We've got board elections coming up this year, and we're actively trying to lower the age of the board and lower the age of the leadership, so that we're getting veterans, particularly from Iraq and Gulf Wars, so people who are now in their 50s and 60s, partly because they've generally got a bit more time, but also bringing on board some of our younger veterans who are coming out in their 20s and 30s. The challenge with that is that most of them are working and they've got families, and so finding the time is tricky. The next thing to talk to you about is Rock for Women. Now this is one that I can be sure that you won't have heard of, even though I've been around for 30 years. So Rock for Women is in Nowra. Until 2015, we ran the domestic violence shelter in Nowra. So the emergency shelter for women who are leaving home and in the middle of the night often and needed somewhere to go. You won't have heard about it because the domestic violence shelter is kept very quiet and under the radar for obvious reasons, which is if there are women leaving home in difficult circumstances, we can't have it known where the shelter is. So we've done that since the 1980s. We were called the Shoalhavens Women's Resource Group at that stage. We've just had a rebrand. In 2015, the New South Wales government decided to change how they funded domestic violence shelters. A lot of the domestic violence shelters in regional and rural areas were being run by little local organisations like Shoalhaven Women's Resource Group, often groups of women who got together in the late 70s, early 80s and said we need to provide a place, and they just did it. And in the mid-2000s, the government decided that wasn't the optimal way to run these things, and that it would be better to, instead of funding all these small community groups to provide these, they would rather have larger organisations run them. So they went through a whole review process called Going Home, Staying Home, and they reallocated the funding for running shelters. In our case, we were quite lucky, so we lost the funding of the shelter, but we lost it to SASI, and now I think some of you will know SASI. SASI is a big organisation down Illawarra and South Coast that runs a range of different housing options, mostly for women and children. So they were a bigger organisation than us, but they had grown out of community roots and they were very much embedded in our community. So we were not unhappy if we were going to lose the running of the shelter to anyone. SASI was who we wanted to lose it to, because what happened in a lot of other towns was that they lost it, was that the running of the shelter was given to enormous organisations like St Vincent de Paul or Salvation Army, all very well needing, but what that meant was that the unique individual running of those centres became part of a big organisation, and there were a lot of challenges with that. When the government changed the funding and took funding away from a lot of these local community groups, there was a bit of an outcry within communities across New South Wales saying, well, hang on, it's all right, well, we'll give some of those groups some money to do something. And so again, just at the time I was joining the Women's Resource Group board, the organisation had suddenly been told that it had $250,000 a year to run a program for women in Nowra. And with no parameters, which in some ways is lovely, but just extraordinary. So we scrambled very quickly, and we knew from the work that we'd been doing with women that there was one of the big needs was for women who were coming out of prison and women who were coming out of drug and alcohol rehabilitation back into the Shoalhaven. to help them get their lives back on track. Now, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of those women were in prison in the first place or in drug and alcohol rehabilitation because of years and years and years of domestic violence that they'd suffered. And so there's a tie-in there anyway. So what we do, what we've been doing for the last, since 2015, is we provide long-term case management to women coming out of prison and drug and alcohol rehab. And now in the last 2 years, we've also actually expanded our focus. We also provide long-term support to women at risk of homelessness. Now, any of you who are following what's going on with housing at the moment will know that homelessness is a massive issue, particularly for women. It's a massive issue down here on the coast. I think you'll have seen some of the statistics. There's a study done, I think last year, of Berry, Bonaderry and surrounds, and it showed that on any given night there were 2,500 houses available for short-term rent, holiday rent, so I think Airbnb and stays. There was one long-term lease available. Just impossible, and part of that, what was happening was that landlords who had been leasing their places at the end of their leases were saying, I don't want to lease this on a long-term basis anymore because I think actually I can get more money if I rent it on a holiday basis. So we were having people who'd been in their leases for 25 or 30 years in the same place suddenly being tipped out, and there was literally nowhere for them to go. And it's not as simple as saying, well, move somewhere else. You know, particularly if you're an older woman and you've spent 30 years in this community, you can't just pack up your life and move to Orange or wherever it might be. This is where your family is, this is where your friends are, this is where your supports are. So it's a very tricky problem. Homelessness New South Wales has put out some statistics. These are about a year old. So across in 2021-22, in New South Wales, 58,000 women used a homelessness service compared to 37,000 men. Compared to the 10 years prior, the proportion of women in New South Wales using homelessness services has increased by 23% compared to 9.8% for men. And for older women, the rate of using homelessness services almost doubled over 10 years. And for the Shoalhaven, compared to 7 years ago, so compared to 2014-2015, 93% more women are now accessing homelessness services in the Shoalhaven than were in 2014-2015. Just extraordinary. For women over 60 in the Shoalhaven, it's been an increase of 360%. So there are 360% more women over 60 in the Shoalhaven needing to use homelessness services because they cannot find somewhere to live. And in the meantime, they are in caravan parks, they are couch surfing on people's, relying on the goodness of friends and neighbours. It's really tricky. So we've expanded our services to work with women, not just women who've come through the justice system, but also women more generally in the Shoalhaven who need help with accessing homes and services. Again, we're a very small organisation. We have 4, I'm about to go and interview more staff, we have 4 staff, and their job is to do everything that needs to be done with those women. It's to help them find employment, it's to help them access mental health care if they need mental health care, it's to help them with finances, it's anything that they need to be able to get back on their feet. The reality is if they don't have a roof over their heads, then it's very difficult to do any of those other things. And we've had people say to us, why aren't you focusing on getting your women jobs? Why aren't you focusing on getting women education? And we've said to them, if you wake up in the morning and you're on someone's couch, you cannot get your mental health in a state to go and work, let alone being able to brush your hair and have the clothes you need to wear and have some healthy food to eat and so on. It's very, very difficult. Our services, so I can tell you last year, just as an example, of our clients at ROC, 35% of them are experiencing homelessness, 49% of them are at risk of homelessness. This is 100 clients we had. And 43% of them said that housing issues were the main reason for them seeking assistance from us. And I thought I'd just read you a little bit of the story of one of the women that we helped. Now this is, I need to say that we support a wide range of women. And some of the women are from very, very, very difficult backgrounds and have, they themselves have done some pretty awful things, but for a whole range of reasons. But we also support women who, I hope not, might be in this room, or might be people that you know in Berry, people that you know in Bonaderry, people that you wouldn't know are having the issues that they're having. and we're increasingly supporting a number of those sorts of women. So the story I'll read you is it's anonymised. That means that we've changed the name basically. And this is one of our more extreme cases, but it's an example of the work we do. So a lady called Mary, she was referred through Nowra Community Corrections, which is the parole office, so having come out of prison. She'd been someone who'd had a life of violence through her childhood and then in adult relationships. She'd been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, anxiety and depression. She'd been to multiple mental health facilities and rehabilitation, and she'd done 3 separate prison terms for shoplifting, driving while disqualified and credit card fraud. Now that in itself tells you something, to be going to prison for shoplifting or, driving while disqualified. They're serious things, but, and every time she did one of those things, because she'd already been in prison, that would exacerbate, mean she gets a longer sentence, but the effect that has on your life for things which in her world may have been just necessary to try and get by are quite astonishing. She had challenges with drugs and alcohol, but was sober and had been sober since her release from prison. She was homeless, so she'd come out of prison, she had 6 months left on her parole, she was homeless and her mental health issues had largely been untreated for several months at the time that she came to us. She had 3 adult children who lived interstate and she lost her connection with them and really wanted to connect with them. She asked us to case manage her support to help her get stable housing, counselling and support. But she found it very, very difficult because of her long-term issues with her family. She found it very difficult to trust anybody and very difficult to connect with support services, and it took several months of our staff just calling her every now and again, having, taking her out for coffee now and again to actually be able to get her to a point where she could actually start actively engaging with us and starting to talk about using some services and doing some things. In the meantime, her mental health had gone down, she was still homeless, she was couch surfing, and this is a big challenge, she was couch surfing with friends and family members, a number of whom were drug users. And this is one of the big problems. So a lot of the women in these situations go into prison, they'll get clean while they're in prison, they'll maybe have some education, but they come out and the only community they have is the community that got them in there in the first place. So it's a real issue. So with the support of one of our staff, her caseworkers, she completed a housing application. She agreed to attend a doctor to have both physical and mental health assessments and get referrals to specialists. It took a long time for her to get to that point. A few months later, she was able to access a psychologist who assisted her to apply for victims' compensation, which meant that she could continue seeing the psychologist with her payment. It turned out, as we got to know her better over a period of about 12 months, that her last prison term was a direct result of the violent relationship she'd been in. She'd left the relationship very suddenly to get out of it, and then ended up living on the street with no access to money because her partner had stolen her key card. She was caught shoplifting for winter clothes because she was living on the streets and cold. And because she was on a community corrections order from her previous prison time, that meant immediately that when she was arrested, she was straight back to prison. We also found out that she had a history of debt and she'd been too ashamed to talk to anybody about the fact that she'd been in debt previously. Her previous partner had taken out multiple loans in her name and then not paid back the loans, so because they were in her name, she'd been liable for them. She then turned to gambling to try and get the money back to pay back these loans and pay the mounting bills, and that had spiralled. Just as she was finishing her parole while she was with us, her daughter contacted her to say that she herself was in a violent relationship and she wanted to leave, but she had nowhere to go. And so Mary became really upset and angry that she couldn't help her daughter. And so she pulled back from working with us. She started to disconnect. She would, spiraled down again. And she returned to drug use as a way of coping with that. So at that point, our staff are trying to maintain contact. Sometimes they'll actually go out to places that they might know that she regularly is to try and find where she is, go to where she's living. But after a few months and constant we're still here for you, she agreed to re-enter rehab, and after 6 months she returned to the community, came back to us, and she was able to get a unit. She got herself a unit. Legal aid helped her with her loans, and she got a payment plan in place, and she's now sober, she's got accommodation, she's met with her daughter on several occasions, and she's met 2 of her grandchildren for the first time. And she still, even though we're now not case managing her because she's on her feet, she still comes to, we run art programs to keep in contact, so she still comes to our art programs, so we see her regularly, and she knows where we are if she needs us. So that is, it sounds almost fantastical. Unfortunately, that is an actual story. That's not something we've made up or cobbled together from different, that is one person's story, and it is very common in our community, and we don't, particularly in burying surrounds, we don't see that. I think if we lived in East Now or that kind of area, we might see that more. Big issue, so that's what we do at ROC. We get no government funding, we do get government funding. We're funded to about $250,000 a year, but that is, we are right at the edges of that funding all the time, like all the other homelessness services in the area. So we are in big discussions, particularly with the election on Saturday, big discussions with government and potential government about how we can get more funding because there's such a demand and such a need for what we're doing. And I do have some pamphlets here, if anyone's interested. There's pamphlets there about ROC. We had a rebrand earlier this year, so we've now got some nice things that we've done. That was a bit of a sad note, so I'll move on to something a little bit happier. The Shoalhaven Education Fund, this is the last one, and then so I'll just have a couple of minutes and then I'll leave you in peace. So the Shoalhaven Education Fund, some of you do know because you've been very generous in supporting us with this, both through the men's shed, through the Uniting Church. We've used the hall for our book fairs. So the Shoalhaven Education Fund was something we started in 2012. We are part of a wider organisation called the Country Education Foundation of Australia, which was started out in Orange. The Country Education Foundation of Australia sits over the top of us, if you like, and it does all our compliance for us, so it manages all our tax returns and does lots of sort of the nitty-gritty that we don't have time to do as volunteers, but we run our own local organisation. We're one of, I think, about 35 organisations dotted all around New South Wales, now also in Victoria, Central Australia, Queensland. I think there's one in Western Australia. We are, essentially what we are is a funnel. I describe us as a funnel. We are just a funnel for funds. So we spend our time going around, knocking on all your doors, running bookstalls, saying we need funds to give to young people in our community to help with their education and training when they finish school. And so we do a fairly limited thing. We supply funds. The young people have to be aged between 16 and 25. They have to have lived or gone to school in the Shoalhaven. They have to demonstrate that they have a financial need, and they have to have a plan for what they want to do for the next few years. There's no academic test, so we're not looking at their academics. I'd say 2/3 of the kids come from public high schools, but some of them come from now Anglican College and St John's as well, because there are plenty of kids at those schools whose parents are doing it tough. What we're trying to do is help them to take that next step after school. So we know that when they finish school, if they want to go to TAFE University, do an apprenticeship, vocational training, the biggest barrier to the kids down here is getting the funds for the practical things. It's not the fees, we don't pay for their fees, but it's if you live anywhere south of South Nowra, how do you get to TAFE? You've got to have a car or university because there's no public transport. How do you need your textbooks, you need a computer these days. If you're a nursing student or a teaching student or a social work student, at some point in your degree you will have to go on practical training in other parts of New South Wales, and when you do that, you will be away from your casual work here, so you won't be able to earn an income while you do that. It'll be sometimes 6 weeks at a time. You'll be paying rent on your place here, but you'll also have to pay rent wherever you're living for your practical. You'll need nursing uniforms and shoes and all sorts of things. So it's all those sorts of things that we supply. We don't give money. We're not allowed by our charter to give money. There's a very good reason why we don't give money, and it's because we know from experience that if we give our young people money, particularly for our Indigenous students, there can be an awful amount of pressure on them from their parents, from their families, from their friends to use that money for something else, for partying or a good time. So what we do is we tell them how much money they have been given for the year, and then they tell us what they want to spend it on. So they either say, I would like this computer, can you buy it for me from Harvey Norman, and we'll go and buy it for them, have it delivered to them.
or they can buy things themselves and then send us the receipts and we reimburse them. And technology is a marvellous thing. When we started this in 2012, it was all terribly slow because it all had to be done by, mailing receipts to us and so on. Now it's all just, they just take a photo on their camera and they text it to us and, it's all very quick. The photo in the top left-hand corner there, that's some of the young people who received funding this year, so for this financial year. Down the bottom you'll recognise that's the men's shed. So this is the 2 students this year who the men's shed have given funds to support. The girl on the left, Elise, in the pink, is doing hairdressing at TAFE, so her money, I don't know if there's an update, so she's used her money to buy her hairdressing tools that she needs to do her hairdressing, so her clippers and her scissors. And the boy on the right, Archie Skinner, he's from Ulladulla, so Elise went to, I think, Bomaderry High. Archie's from Ulladulla, he's an amazing young man. He wants to be an engineer, but he particularly wants to be an engineer on F1 racing cars. So he has gone to the Gold Coast because the only place you can study that very specific type of engineering is at one of the university on the Gold Coast, and so he's moved up there. And so the funding we've given here, or the funding the men's shed have given him and we've put some into will help pay his rent up there. It's taken off. When we started it, the lady whose idea it was said that she hoped that we might be able to give 6 or 7 scholarships a year, maybe $10,000–15,000. This year, and it's grown every year, so this year, which is our 11th year now, we gave $125,000 to 36 students. The other part, and that was just this year, so we've just hit, I think we're just about to hit the $700,000 mark that we've given out in the 11 years that we've been doing it. The other thing that's really important about our relationship with the Country Education Foundation is that they're a big organisation. They form relationships with the universities and with the TAFEs and also with private philanthropic donors, so big charities that have money to give away, a lot of them family. And through that, some of our kids get matching funds. So for example, Archie in the middle there, because he received an award for a scholarship from us, he was then eligible. We were able to put him forward for further funding provided by Audi the cars, not Audi the supermarket. And so he received another $5,000 from, I think it was $5,000, from Audi for this year, and he was only eligible for that because he received funding from us. And there's lots of the universities will match the funding that the SEF kids get. The other big donor for us has been the Snow Foundation. So some of you might be aware of Terry Snow, who lives in Canberra Airport, a very wealthy man. He set up a philanthropic organisation to use some of his wealth for good causes. He built Belinda Park down at, which is a big dressage facility down at Borley Point. So he, a few years ago, the foundation a few years ago contacted our parent body and said, we know that Shoalhaven Education Fund is doing this on the South Coast, we'd like to support that. And for the first year they gave us one lot of $5,000, and we gave that out and told them who it had gone to and they now support us. They give us $35,000 a year. Which has to be spent on 7 students, so 7 lots of $35,000, which is amazing, because for us to know that we've got that every year, it just lifts the weight off our shoulders, which is every year us saying, right, where are we going to get the money for the next year's students, because there's so much demand. So there's a few organisations like that. So it's very much a community, very much a group effort. All the funds we get, so there's no government funding at all the funds come from our local community groups, our local businesses, local individuals. We do a little bit of fundraising ourselves, so you'll see our book stall that we run 3 or 4 times a year out in Broughton Walk. But we've been very fortunate to have other organisations that will actually fundraise for us, so they'll run a Bunnings barbecue and give us the proceeds, or the Shoalhaven Professional Business Association runs an annual dinner that they want to run anyway, but they do some fundraising on the night for us. So this is very much, as I say, a funnel. We're just the people who administer the money. The community gives us the money, we take the money, we give it to the kids and make sure it's being spent in the right way. And it's an amazing effort, and we now are seeing kids coming back to the community who we've sponsored. I wanted to play you, let's see if this works, as the final thing for this morning. This is going to work. This is a video, so we celebrated our 10th anniversary last year, and Hill-to-Air Media volunteered to make a video for us with some of our alumni. It's about 5 minutes, I think. The piece of music that you'll hear at the beginning or playing through it was written by a young man from Bomaderry. His mother got in touch with us last year, midway through the year, and said he's studying music at Stella. He wants to study music at Stella Studios, and we need some help with the software that he needs to be able to write music. It turned out this young man is non-verbal autistic, so he doesn't talk, and he's never really talked. He has a range of other issues. She's a single mum. She works 2 jobs to just keep a roof over their heads and support him. And she said, I said, well, you know, we went through a whole process. There's a whole formal process we go through deciding whether this is someone who needs the funds and so on. But as part of that, we said, well, if he is non-verbal autistic, how does he sing? And she said, well, this is what we didn't know until we started. All of a sudden in his mid-teens, they had an opportunity and he started singing, and he'd never communicated with anyone. So he wrote this piece of music and gave us permission to use it for this video. So have a listen, it's absolutely amazing, you'll hear it. And you'll hear also from a couple of our alumni, if I can make this work. It's supposed to be this. I don't know what bit of sound. I don't know if you can hear that.
Nothing's gonna stand in our way.
Sophie.
I'm sick of always spinning around. No matter what they're gonna say, they're crushing me and hoping I'll drown. Praying I'll rise to the top, wishing all my luck upon my stars. Crashing and burning, soon I might fall. Just me and myself.
So my name is Liz Philpott. I was Wilson at the time. I'm 29 in like a week and a bit. So I grew up in Granville Point. I'm still local to the Shoalhaven area. Just couldn't afford to buy out there, of course. But so I've been local my whole life. My family were all fishermen. So yeah.
My name is Michaela Barnes and I'm from Jervis Bay.
I went to Sussex Public School and then went to Vincennia High School. Just to start my apprenticeship in plumbing, but did some work experience with Meadow Plumbing, and they were a good company, did a wide variety of plumbing, so yeah, I enjoyed work experience and moved up there. I got in contact with them started last year, I think it was, because I was obviously looking to start my apprenticeship and moving to Wollongong by myself, which was a big thing, so any support would help. So yeah, got involved then, yeah.
I went to our high school. It was 2019 and I heard about them through Sophie, and I came down for an interview, and yeah, the whole process was pretty amazing actually. I learned a lot. When I reached out to the SEF, I was encouraged to join their interview process, and I came down from Wollongong. I was living in Wollongong at the time, studying a Bachelor of Commerce, majoring in HR and PR. So I came down and did the interview, and everyone was very friendly.
So it was my second year at uni, which was the first year that the SEF ran their funding. So they gave me a grant and I used it for mostly textbooks, because that was back in the day before any of them were uploaded to the internet, like to the library on UOW, which I think most of them are now. And so each semester we were expected to spend like $2,000 on textbooks. Got the funding the next year, in my final year, and I used some of that to buy a new computer, which we only just replaced this year, like a few months ago. So it's done really well, because we had to make a move in our third year, which was irrelevant from nursing, but my computer would not handle the moving software, so I had to find a new one, but thanks God for the SES.
Oh, it's I was living by myself up in Wollongong, riding on bike to work. So as soon as I was able to get my license, they helped me
one of the lucky recipients of that. And they helped with a number of things like petrol, rent, textbooks. I was able to achieve a lot of the goals at uni that I wouldn't otherwise have achieved.
So I'm back down in Sophie now, still plumbing on third year in January.
So Bachelor of Nursing. So nursing still, I got my first preference of the rehab and stroke ward at Shoalhaven Hospital, and I've been there for 7.5 years now.
So post-university, I graduate at the end of this year. I've been at uni for 4 years, still studying, and potentially going on to do some more study in honours. But I've been lucky enough to gain a job at Climax Air Conditioning, which actually came from an interview I did for SEF 2 years ago. So my current employer reached out, and yeah, it just came about, and I've been able to stay in the Shoalhaven and live in the beautiful Jervis Bay ever since.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, kids don't need to take in their step early, like leaving school early and getting into a trade. I think is the best thing to do, and the SEF support would definitely be a massive help.
Yeah, big time. They were a huge help, not only with the monetary, which is obviously really helpful, especially when you're from, local fisherman family who doesn't really have that much cash to splash, but also just the support that they gave was amazing, helping me through uni. And I feel like being forced to go to that interview to get the funding that I had to do, I'd never been to a job interview or anything like that before. My dad got me a job as a team at the local fish market. So I think putting myself through that forced me to get used to interviews, and that way I think I got my new grad position because of that sort of practice, because otherwise I wouldn't have had anything before I started, which was,
Absolutely. I always recommend the SEF. I sent it to a couple of the friends that I have at the moment that are a bit younger and from the Shoalhaven area, wanting to stay in the Shoalhaven, but not necessarily having the resources to do so. So absolutely, I would recommend them 100%.
I'd like to say thanks overall for all the support. It definitely helped me at a young age to get started on my apprenticeship, and I'm still doing it, which is great. And finish my trade and do my licensing and hopefully start my own business. So just like to thank SDF for all the support.
Particularly, I'd like to thank everyone for helping me through and for the support they gave, but especially Linda and Sue. They were both just amazing people. They still are amazing people, but just having their support and seeing them was really awesome.
Hello. So I'm conscious of time. I've gone way over time, for which I apologise. Look, the thank you there really goes to all of you as well, because as I said, this is a community effort. So although they see it as being the SEF, we're actually quite big on making sure that they understand that this is not in the community. So really that's it from me. I guess just two things I wanted to say at the end. One is, although I'm here talking about my involvement with these organisations, they are very much team efforts. I'm just one person on the board, and the board is a small group of people who are overseeing amazing staff, particularly the staff in all those organisations who are on the front line doing the work, making things happen. So it's, one of the great joys of my life is being able to actually be part of those teams and have a little contribution to that. And the second thing I wanted to say is that I recognise that I'm extremely privileged to be able to do this sort of work. Some of it pays me, a lot of it's voluntary, and I can only do that because I've got a great husband who supports me to do that and believes in it, and because we've managed to build a business and build a life that allows us to do that. I've had a few interesting conversations with people, and you would all know the challenges for all of our community groups here is getting younger people involved and finding volunteers to take over from us. Not easy, because I think the things that young people now have to do just to put a roof over their heads and hold down many jobs and so on. There's just no time. Somebody said to me recently, and it made me something that really opened my eyes, which is I think what I thought I certainly have to get better at being flexible.
Excuse me, I've got to take those two jobs.
I'm sorry, I've gone over time. Thank you for coming. Getting better at being flexible with how people want to volunteer. So instead of saying, I need a secretary or I need someone to run the fundraising, if people come and say, look, I've got half an hour a week and I could do your social media, saying, okay, great, you do that bit, someone else do this bit. And over time, those people will have more time and they'll take on those other roles. So that's been a really big lesson for me this year. So yeah, I'm very fortunate. I think I titled this Having a Rich Life. I'm fortunate to have a rich life because I'm surrounded by amazing people in this community and the other communities that I work in. And we're all pulling together to do things. So if you've got any questions, very happy to answer them. I do have to duck off in about 10 minutes because I've got to go to Rock and interview people for a new caseworker role. So, but really lovely to be here. Thank you for listening. I hope some of that was interesting. And Janet and John know where to find me if you ever want any more information about any of the things I've talked about today. So thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. That was an absolutely amazing account of all of the things that you're involved in. And I think the wonderful thing is that the way that you're using the talents that you have to support so many different people in the community. And it was great that the week before last, I think it was, that Sophie was recognised with an award in the International Women's Day Awards run by Berry Zonda Club. Wonderful that you were recognised and rewarded in that way. So yeah, that's fantastic to hear. So much that I didn't know that you were involved with, and just a wonderful contribution that you're making to the community. So once again, let's say thank you to Sophie.